What happens when the world's greatest republic turns its sword against itself? When loyalty, power, and destiny collide beneath the marble skies of Rome? This is the story of Julius Caesar and Pompey, two men who once called each other brothers but whose ambitions tore the ancient world apart. Before empires, before emperors, there was Rome, the beating heart of civilization, and this is how it changed forever. If you love calm storytelling, ancient history, and the rise and fall of great empires, make sure to subscribe, and let's journey together through the storm that shaped the world. The year was 49 before Christ. The city of Rome, once the proud center of the ancient world, stood at the height of its power, yet on the edge of collapse. Its marble temples gleamed in the Italian sun, its streets were alive with merchants, soldiers, and orators, and its senate still echoed with the voices of those who claimed to defend the republic. But beneath the glory, something darker stirred: fear, ambition, and the whisper of civil war. Among the countless men who walked those storied streets, two names rose above all others: Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey the Great. To the citizens of Rome, they were legends made flesh, heroes who had expanded the republic's borders, crushed foreign kings, and filled the city's coffers with gold. Yet fate had bound them together only to tear them apart. At this time, Rome was not yet an empire ruled by emperors, but a republic governed by elected leaders and a senate of aristocrats. However, real power did not rest in laws or traditions. It rested in the hands of ambitious men with loyal armies. The republic's victories had brought enormous wealth, but also endless corruption. Senators fought for influence, generals fought for fame, and the people were torn between hope and hunger. In the heart of the Forum stood the statue of the goddess Roma, symbol of unity. Yet that unity was an illusion. The Senate debated endlessly about taxes, colonies, and power, while behind closed doors, alliances and betrayals were being forged like weapons. The Republic's greatest strength, its democracy, was slowly becoming its greatest weakness. Too many powerful men sought control, and too few remembered why Rome had once been great: discipline, justice, and a shared purpose. Pompey the Great had once been the shining star of Rome. Tall, dignified, and commanding, he had conquered lands in the east and returned home in triumph. He was called Magnus, meaning the Great, a title few dared to question. Pompey dreamed of restoring order to Rome, yet his heart belonged to tradition and the Senate, the ancient guardians of the Republic, as laws. Julius Caesar, by contrast, was the man of the people. Charismatic, brilliant, and daring, he had risen from debt and scandal to command Rome's armies in Gaul. For nearly a decade he had fought among mountains and forests, leading his legions to victory after victory. His soldiers adored him. His enemies feared him. Where Pompey represented stability, Caesar represented change, and change was what many Romans secretly desired. Years earlier, these two men had been allies. Along with Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, they had formed what historians later called the First Triumvirate, a private agreement to share power in a republic that was losing its balance. Caesar brought popularity, Pompey brought military prestige, and Crassus brought gold. Together they ruled more effectively than the Senate itself. But as the years passed, ambition began to divide them. Crassus fell in battle against the Parthians, and the alliance that had once held Rome together began to crumble. The Senate grew wary of Caesar's growing power, while Pompey, once Caesar's friend, slowly aligned himself with Rome's conservative elite. The friendship between Caesar and Pompey was not merely political. It was also personal. Caesar's daughter, Julia, had been married to Pompey, creating a bond between two mighty houses. Yet when Julia died during childbirth, the bridge between them weakened. Without her gentle presence, suspicion and pride replaced affection. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's influence, began to whisper in Pompey's ear. They told him that Caesar sought to make himself king, a title Rome despised. They reminded Pompey that his own fame was fading, while Caesar's grew brighter with every victory in Gaul. At first, Pompey resisted these whispers. He remembered the man who had once called him ally and friend. But power has its own music, and soon Pompey began to listen. After nearly 10 years of campaigning, Caesar had transformed his army into one of the most disciplined and loyal forces in history. His soldiers, who called him their general, were bound to him by respect and shared hardship. They had crossed icy rivers, faced fierce tribes, and conquered all of Gaul. Yet Caesar knew that true victory lay not in distant lands but in Rome itself. The Senate demanded that Caesar disband his army and return home as a private citizen, a move that would leave him defenseless against his enemies. Caesar, aware of the danger, hesitated. He wanted peace, but he also wanted justice. He feared that without his legions, the Senate, now led by Pompey, would destroy everything he had built. And so the stage was set. Two of the greatest men Rome had ever produced stood on opposite sides of destiny. Neither wanted war, yet both believed they were defending the Republic. Between Caesar and Rome flowed a small, shallow river called the Rubicon. According to Roman law, no general was permitted to cross that river with an army. To do so was to declare rebellion against the state. For days, Caesar stood at its banks, torn between loyalty and survival. His officers urged caution. His heart urged courage. As he gazed into the misty water, he knew that one step forward would change history forever. Finally, legend says he spoke the words, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast. He crossed the river, not with the roar of battle, but with a quiet resolve. His soldiers followed, carrying the future of Rome on their shields. That single act marked the beginning of a conflict that would shake the ancient world. Not a war of foreign conquest, but a war of Roman against Roman, brother against brother. News of Caesar's movement spread through Italy like wildfire. The Senate was seized with panic. Some fled the city, others begged Pompey to act. The citizens of Rome watched in disbelief as their leaders prepared for a war none of them truly wanted. Pompey gathered his supporters and declared that he would defend the Republic against Caesar's ambition. Caesar, meanwhile, claimed he was defending the rights of the people against the greed of the Senate. Both saw themselves as Rome's savior. Both were sincere, and both were wrong. As night fell over the city, torches burned in the Forum, casting long shadows on the walls of the Senate House. Rome, once united under the banner of victory, now trembled under the weight of its own greatness. The Republic that had conquered the world could not conquer itself. Thus began the war that would decide the fate of Rome. A war born not from foreign invasion, but from pride, fear, and ambition. A war between two men who had once shared triumphs, laughter, and dreams of glory. In the quiet hours of the night, as the Tiber River flowed under the moonlight, one could almost hear the echo of the coming storm, a storm that would sweep across the Mediterranean and leave behind a new world. And so, with the crossing of the Rubicon, Rome turned against itself. In the long centuries before Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great stood face to face across the Italian plains, Rome had already known greatness and danger. Its legions had conquered much of the known world, spreading Roman roads, language, and laws to lands stretching from the rocky shores of Hispania to the deserts of Syria. Yet for all its triumphs abroad, Rome was slowly losing peace within. The Republic, built on ideals of shared power and civic duty, was no longer the same republic its founders had imagined. Its Senate, once a council of wise men, had become a stage for ambition. Elections were won with gold instead of honor, speeches became weapons, and loyalty was bought more easily than earned. Behind the marble facades of the Forum, a quiet struggle raged, one between the optimates, who represented the wealthy elite, and the populares, who claimed to speak for the people. This ancient tension would one day explode into the war between Caesar and Pompey. The late Roman Republic was a place of splendor and strain. The streets were crowded with triumphal processions, musicians, and philosophers, yet also with beggars and wounded soldiers returning from foreign wars. Vast estates were owned by the few, while thousands of farmers lost their lands to debt. To the poor, the Senate seemed distant, even cruel. Laws often favored those who already had power. The common people turned their hope toward generals, men who promised them bread, land, and glory. This shift in loyalty was the Republic's undoing. The Senate feared any man too beloved by the people, while the people distrusted a Senate too loyal to its own wealth. Caesar and Pompey rose within this divide, each offering a different vision of Rome's future. Long before Caesar's rise, Pompey had already carved his name into Roman history. As a young commander, he earned victory after victory, defeating pirates who had terrorized the Mediterranean and crushing rebellions in the East. His campaigns in Asia made him a hero. Temples were built in his honor, and poets compared him to Alexander the Great. Pompey valued order above all else. To him, Rome's greatness lay in its traditions, the Senate, the laws, the old ways that had guided the Republic for centuries. He sought peace at home after years of war, yet he also desired recognition, the respect he believed he had earned through his service. When he returned to Rome from his eastern conquests, he expected the Senate to honor him with land for his soldiers and approval of his new settlements. But instead, the Senate hesitated, fearing his influence. They offered him half-promises and endless debates. Pompey felt betrayed. The Republic he had defended refused to trust him. That wound would drive him into the arms of Caesar, and eventually against him. While Pompey's star shone in the east, Julius Caesar was rising in the west. Born into a noble but struggling family, Caesar grew up surrounded by both privilege and hardship. He studied rhetoric, learned philosophy, and served as a soldier in Asia. Yet what truly set him apart was his mind, quick, sharp, and fearless. Unlike many nobles, Caesar understood the struggles of the common people. He knew that Rome's power rested not only in its armies, but in the hearts of its citizens. Through charm and vision, he built a following among the masses. His speeches were fiery yet hopeful, his promises bold yet believable. When he became consul, Caesar pushed reforms to help farmers and veterans. The Senate resisted, accusing him of seeking too much power. But Caesar was clever. He allied himself with Pompey and Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Together, they formed an unofficial pact to rule Rome from behind the scenes. The alliance became known as the First Triumvirate, though at the time no one dared give it a name. Each member of the triumvirate gained something vital. Caesar gained the military command he desired, the provinces of Gaul, where he could win glory and build loyalty. Pompey gained land grants for his veterans and influence over the Senate. Crassus gained economic privileges and a chance to balance the power of the other two. For a few brief years, their partnership worked. Caesar's conquests in Gaul filled Rome's treasuries with gold. Pompey maintained peace in the city, and Crassus expanded his wealth through trade. But beneath the surface, envy began to grow. Caesar's victories made him immensely popular, and his reports from Gaul read like epics, each triumph a tale of courage and destiny. The people began to cheer his name more than Pompey's. The Senate, once hostile, now grew fearful. Pompey, too, felt the shift. He had once been called the Great, but now the whispers spoke of Caesar the Conqueror. His pride began to harden into suspicion. The death of Crassus changed everything. In his final campaign against the Parthians in the east, he was defeated and his army destroyed. With his death, the triumvirate lost its balance, and Rome lost its last mediator. At the same time, tragedy struck closer to home. Caesar's beloved daughter, Julia, who was also Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. Her passing removed the final bond of affection between the two men. Without Julia, their alliance became only politics, and politics in Rome was a dangerous game. The Senate saw an opportunity. Many senators envied Caesar's power and believed that Pompey could be used to limit him. They flattered Pompey, giving him new titles and honors, convincing him that only he could save Rome from Caesar's growing ambition. Pompey, weary of conflict but proud of his reputation, accepted. Gradually, he began to distance himself from his former ally. Caesar, still in Gaul, watched with growing concern. Letters between them grew shorter, colder, until finally they stopped. By the time Caesar completed his campaigns, the Senate had passed a decree. He must disband his army and return to Rome to face investigation. It was a move designed to strip him of power, and possibly his life. Caesar's friends warned him. If he entered Rome as a private citizen, his enemies would destroy him. Pompey, now aligned with the Senate, would not defend him. The Republic had chosen sides, and so, as Caesar stood by the banks of the Rubicon, the choices of the past echoed like thunder. Years of rivalry, mistrust, and ambition had led to this moment. The alliance that had once promised peace now promised war. Pompey, once Caesar's friend, had become the defender of the Senate's authority. Caesar, once the Senate's rising star, had become the champion of the people. Each believed he was saving Rome, and in their conviction, both would destroy it. The sky above the Italian hills was calm, but history itself was holding its breath. The storm was coming. The winter air was cold and heavy with silence. The narrow river called the Rubicon, winding through the northern plains of Italy, had become more than a stream of water. It was now the boundary between peace and civil war. On one side stood Julius Caesar with his loyal legion, men who had followed him through forests and mountains for almost a decade. On the other side lay Rome, trembling in uncertainty. Caesar's choice was not made in haste. For months he had watched from Gaul as the Senate, under the growing influence of Pompey, stripped him of his command and demanded his return as a private citizen. He had offered negotiation, compromise, even retirement. But each message returned with colder words. The Senate had already declared him a threat to the Republic. Now the only path open to him was forward. The soldiers waited in silence as Caesar looked into the flowing water. The torches flickered. The night wind whispered through the armor of his men. In that stillness, Caesar spoke softly. "The die is cast." Then he crossed the river. It was a moment that would echo through centuries. By crossing the Rubicon, Caesar had broken an ancient Roman law that forbade any general from leading troops into Italy. It was not merely a march. It was a declaration that he would no longer be ruled by those who sought to destroy him. The soldiers followed without hesitation. They were not marching against Rome in their hearts. They believed they were marching to restore justice, to defend the honor of their general, and to protect the dignity of the Republic from corruption. Each step southward was heavy with destiny. News of Caesar's crossing reached Rome within days. The Senate, shocked and terrified, fell into chaos. Senators shouted across the chamber. Some demanded negotiation, others called for Caesar's arrest. But one voice silenced them all: Pompey the Great. Pompey, now officially the defender of the Republic, assured the Senate that he could raise an army easily. "If Caesar dares to come," he declared, "I can stamp my foot, and legions will rise from the soil of Italy." Yet, when he tried to rally troops, reality proved harsher than pride. Many provinces hesitated to choose sides. Some feared Caesar's reputation, others doubted the Senate's cause. Within weeks, Pompey realized he could not hold Italy. Rather than face Caesar in open battle, he ordered the Senate and loyal forces to withdraw southward to Brundisium, a port city from which they could escape to Greece. Rome, the eternal city, was left nearly empty. When Caesar's army entered Rome, there was no fighting, no resistance, only silence. The great capital of the ancient world stood still, its temples untouched, its people watching in awe. Caesar walked through the forum not as a conqueror, but as a man searching for reason. He entered the Senate house, looked upon the empty seats, and sighed. "Even now," he is said to have murmured, "they flee the shadow of peace." Rather than seize power immediately, Caesar focused on restoring order. He forbade looting and demanded discipline. He opened the granaries, ensuring food for the people. To many citizens he seemed not a tyrant, but a protector. His calmness in victory made him more powerful than any battle could have done. Still, he knew that true victory required confronting Pompey, and Pompey was gathering strength across the sea. Pompey's retreat to Greece was not one of defeat, but of strategy. He knew that in the east the provinces were loyal to him. The kings and governors of Greece, Asia, and Egypt respected his name. There he could build an army strong enough to face Caesar on equal ground. In the port of Brundisium, under the pale light of early morning, Pompey boarded a ship and looked back toward the Italian coast. He believed he was leaving temporarily, that he would return soon in triumph. Yet deep inside, he must have felt the weight of history pressing upon him. The war had begun, though no great battle had yet been fought. Rome itself became a city of whispers. Families were divided, brothers supporting opposite sides, fathers and sons unsure whom to trust. Merchants worried for trade, farmers feared for their harvests, and the Senate, now scattered across the Mediterranean, issued orders that few obeyed. In the marketplaces, people asked quietly, "Who is right, Caesar or Pompey?" Some said Caesar had broken the law. Others said he was the only one brave enough to face the corruption of the Senate. Most simply prayed for peace. The republic that had ruled so many nations could no longer rule its own heart. As winter gave way to spring, Caesar acted with astonishing speed. In mere months he secured all of Italy without bloodshed. His strategy was clear: move quickly, offer pardon instead of punishment, and present himself as the man of peace forced into war. He sent letters to Pompey, urging negotiation. "We are both Roman citizens," he wrote, "and Rome needs no foreign enemy while her sons destroy one another." But Pompey refused. To him, any peace with Caesar would mean the end of the Republic's laws. Caesar then turned westward to Spain, where Pompey's commanders had raised armies. "I go to fight an army without a leader," he told his men, "and later we shall face a leader without an army." His words carried both strategy and confidence, and they proved true. By the end of the summer of 49 before Christ, Spain had submitted to Caesar's authority. He returned to Italy victorious, preparing to cross the Adriatic Sea and face Pompey himself. Beyond Rome, the world held its breath. In Egypt, the young Queen Cleopatra observed the rising storm with careful eyes, knowing that the victor of this war would shape her nation's future. In Greece and Asia, cities fortified their walls, uncertain which side to join. The Roman legions stationed across the provinces watched and waited, torn between loyalty to their generals and loyalty to the Republic. The Mediterranean, once united under the eagle of Rome, had become a chessboard of alliances and fears. Though separated by sea and strategy, Caesar and Pompey were bound by the same conviction, that they, and only they, could save Rome. Pompey believed he was protecting the Republic from tyranny, preserving the Senate and the old order. He saw himself as a guardian of tradition, chosen by destiny to defend Roman liberty. Caesar, on the other hand, believed that the Republic had already fallen into decay. To him, reform was impossible under the Senate's corruption. He dreamed of a new Rome, disciplined, unified, and ruled by vision rather than privilege. Both men loved Rome deeply, but they loved their own idea of Rome more. By the closing months of 49 before Christ, both sides were ready. Caesar commanded loyalty, speed, and daring. Pompey commanded numbers, resources, and legitimacy. The conflict between them was no longer a question of if, but when. The die that Caesar had cast at the Rubicon continued to roll across the world, gathering momentum. Rome had entered a new age, one that would decide whether it would remain a republic or become something far greater and far more dangerous. The roads built by Roman hands now led not to distant lands, but toward the heart of destiny itself. The world had never seen men like Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Each was a symbol of Rome's glory, and yet each carried within him the seeds of its undoing. Their story was not merely one of strategy or armies, but of pride, fear, and longing for greatness. As winter faded into spring, both leaders prepared for what they knew could not be avoided, a final confrontation. The world called it a civil war. For Caesar and Pompey, it was something far more personal, a battle for Rome's soul. In his camp near Brundisium, Julius Caesar spent his nights writing letters by lamplight. His tent was modest, his desk covered in scrolls and maps. Outside, soldiers sang softly, repairing armor and mending sandals after long marches. They trusted him completely, not as a distant ruler, but as one of their own. Caesar's thoughts, however, were far from peace. He remembered the early days of his career, his debts, his risks, the laughter of those who had once mocked him. He remembered how he had promised himself to make Rome greater, cleaner, wiser. He had never imagined that promise would lead him to war against his own friend. In quiet moments, Caesar read letters from Rome, pleas from senators who begged him to show mercy, accusations from others who called him a traitor. Yet what hurt him most were not their words, but the memory of Pompey. Once they had shared triumphs and dreams. Pompey had married his beloved daughter, Julia. Caesar had celebrated Pompey's victories as his own. They had stood side by side as equals, the two most powerful men in the world. Now he wondered, when did friendship turn to fear? When did respect become rivalry? To his soldiers, Caesar was strong, confident, unshakable. But within his heart, a question lingered, whether history would remember him as a savior or as the destroyer of the republic he claimed to protect. Across the Adriatic Sea, in the Greek city of Dyrrhachium, Pompey the Great walked along the coastline at dawn. The wind carried the scent of salt and the sound of the sea. His cloak fluttered as he gazed toward the horizon, toward Italy, toward home. Pompey was older than Caesar by several years. He had seen the rise and fall of countless men, had been celebrated in triumphal parades, and had felt the cheers of Rome lift him higher than any mortal should rise. Yet as he stood before the endless water, he felt a weariness that victory could not erase. The Senate surrounded him now, offering advice, flattery, and fear. They called him the shield of the Republic. They said he was destined to save Rome from tyranny, and Pompey wanted to believe them. He had always seen himself as a servant of order, a protector of law. But deep inside, he knew that Rome's old ways were fading. The republic he fought to defend no longer truly existed. Senators whispered in corners, seeking safety more than principle. Even among his allies, loyalty was fragile. Still, Pompey's sense of duty would not allow him to turn away. If Rome must be saved, he once told his advisers, then it shall be by the law, not the sword. Yet the truth was that both law and sword now answered to pride. Both men believed they acted for Rome. Both feared what the other might do if victorious, and both could not see that, in their struggle, the Republic itself was dying. For Caesar, the war was a mission to cleanse corruption, to renew the ideals that had once made Rome great. For Pompey, it was a stand for tradition, for the Senate, and for the memory of the ancestors who had built the Republic's foundations. Neither could imagine a world where both could exist. Letters passed between them, offers of peace, negotiations for safety. But behind every word lay suspicion. "Let us meet as friends," Caesar once wrote, "for the sake of Rome." Pompey replied, "Let us meet when Rome no longer trembles at your legions." They both meant what they said, and both knew it would never happen. At night, under the stars, Caesar often spoke with his officers about destiny. "A man," he once said, must follow the road the gods have placed before him, even if that road leads to the end of all things. His men listened, not as soldiers to a commander, but as followers to a prophet. They believed that Caesar's victories were not mere chance, but the will of fate. Pompey, meanwhile, addressed the Senate with a different kind of authority. His speeches were calm, filled with reason. Rome has endured kings, tyrants, and traitors, he reminded them. She shall endure this storm as well. His words inspired hope, but also revealed his burden. He was not only fighting Caesar, he was fighting time itself. The old republic, with its laws and customs, was slipping away. No matter who won, the Rome that had once been would never return. Though history remembers them as giants, both men were human, capable of doubt, sorrow, and longing. Caesar, despite his ambition, often paused to write letters of forgiveness. He pardoned those who had abandoned him, believing mercy to be more powerful than vengeance. Pompey, despite his pride, felt loneliness. Without Julia, his world seemed emptier. He missed the laughter they once shared, the gentleness she had brought into a life of battles and councils. Sometimes he dreamed of returning to Rome not as a victor, but simply as a husband and father. Both had loved deeply, and both had lost more than they ever admitted. As preparations for war intensified, the Mediterranean world seemed to hold its breath. Cities pledged loyalty to one side or the other. Messengers carried secret letters across seas and deserts. Armies trained, ships were built, and spies watched every move. Yet amid the clamor of history, there was a strange stillness, a silence before the storm. The soldiers under Caesar's banner sang songs of unity and fate. Those under Pompey prayed for protection and honor. No one truly wanted to fight, yet none could escape the tide that carried them forward. 2 men, 2 armies, 1 destiny. On a cool evening near the Adriatic coast, Caesar stood looking west toward the fading sunset. His aide, Mark Antony, approached and asked, "What troubles you, my general?" Caesar answered softly, "That I must conquer my own country to save it." Across the sea, Pompey looked at the same sunset, unaware that his rival was watching the same horizon. "Rome will rise again," he whispered to himself. "It must." Neither man knew that within a year one would stand victorious, and the other would fall into history's sorrowful silence. The stage was set, their hearts were steady. The march of destiny would soon reach its thunderous peak. The clash between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had been years in the making. It began with words, grew through fear, and finally erupted into war. Now, in the year 48 before Christ, the struggle for Rome's soul reached its most desperate hour. Across seas and mountains legions marched, cities trembled, and families prayed. Rome, once the heart of order and civilization, had turned its sword upon itself. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he began not just a military campaign, but a transformation of history itself. Pompey had fled Italy with the Senate, gathering his forces in Greece. His strategy was to draw Caesar far from home, cut off his supplies, and crush him with superior numbers. Pompey's navy dominated the sea, while Caesar's legions, though fierce, lacked ships. Yet Caesar's genius lay not in numbers, but in movement. Swift, unpredictable, relentless. In the cold dawn light, his soldiers loaded onto borrowed vessels and crossed the Adriatic through storm and fog. Waves slammed against wooden hulls, and the cries of oarsmen echoed across the dark waters. Many thought they were doomed, but Caesar's confidence burned brighter than fear. "Fortune," he said, "favors the bold," and fortune, for a time, seemed to obey him. In Greece, Pompey's camp at Dyrrhachium became the center of power. Tens of thousands of men, senators, and nobles filled its fortified walls. His army was vast, cavalry, archers, slingers, and legions from every province loyal to the old republic. When Caesar landed, his forces were fewer, hungry, and exhausted. Yet he did not retreat. Instead, he surrounded Pompey's camp with miles of trenches and fortifications, a wall against a wall. It was a strategy of pure audacity. Pompey, astonished, said to his generals, "Does Caesar think he can imprison the world's greatest army?" For weeks, the two sides glared at each other from opposite earthworks. The sun scorched the land, food ran low, and water turned foul. Caesar's men began to suffer. Still, he refused to surrender the initiative. At last, Pompey struck, breaking through Caesar's lines in a fierce counterattack. Arrows darkened the sky, catapults thundered, and men screamed as fire consumed the barricades. Caesar's legions, though disciplined, were forced to retreat. That day, Pompey won a victory. Caesar lost hundreds of men. But even in defeat, Caesar's calm never wavered. He told his officers, "Pompey may know how to win a battle, but he does not know how to use victory." After Dyrrhachium, Caesar's army limped through the Greek countryside. Supplies were scarce. Men marched barefoot, their armor rusted by sweat and blood. Yet they followed Caesar as if he were destiny itself. In the quiet of the night, he walked among the campfires, speaking softly to his soldiers. "You have conquered Gaul," he reminded them. "You have crossed seas and rivers no Roman dared before. Will you now fear men who flee from their own courage?" They shouted back, "Never!" Morale, once flickering, flared again. The name Caesar became a spell, one that turned despair into fire. Pompey pursued cautiously, urged by senators to crush his enemy once and for all. His advisers warned him, "The people love Caesar. Defeat him quickly, or Rome herself will turn." And so Pompey decided to meet Caesar in open battle, in the fields of Pharsalus. The morning of August 9th, 48 before Christ, dawned under a sky of dust and thunderclouds. The plains of Pharsalus stretched wide and flat, a stage prepared by fate. On one side stood Pompey's grand army, nearly twice the size of Caesar's. On the other stood Caesar's weary legions, scarred, hungry, but burning with loyalty. Pompey commanded from a hill, surrounded by senators who had fled Rome. He believed victory was certain. "Caesar's army will break on the first charge," he said. "We will end this rebellion by midday." Caesar rode before his men, cloak whipping in the wind. His voice carried across the ranks. "Today we fight not for power, but for Rome's future. Let them call us traitors. History will call us saviors." Trumpets blared. The earth shook. The two greatest armies of the age collided in fury. Pompey ordered his cavalry to crush Caesar's right flank, expecting a swift rout. But Caesar had predicted it. Hidden behind his front line, he placed a reserve of elite soldiers, veterans from Gaul, men who had followed him for 10 years. When Pompey's horsemen charged, Caesar's veterans advanced in perfect silence, stabbing upward into the faces of riders, cutting reins, bringing chaos. The mighty cavalry scattered, and Pompey's line began to waver. Caesar saw his moment. He raised his arm, and his legions surged forward. Shields clashed, blades flashed, dust rose like smoke from hell. Hours later, the field fell silent. Pompey's army was shattered. Senators fled, dropping togas and titles. Bodies lay across the plains of Thessaly, their blood feeding the soil of history. Pompey escaped with a handful of ships. Caesar, standing amid the ruins, whispered, "They would have it thus." Pompey fled south to Egypt, hoping for refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, whose court had long respected him. But politics knows no loyalty. Fearing Caesar's wrath, Ptolemy's advisers decided to curry favor with the victor. As Pompey stepped ashore, exhausted and unarmed, he was struck down by assassins. Once soldiers of Rome, now slaves to fear. His final words were said to have been, "Do I die thus?" When Caesar arrived days later, he was shown Pompey's severed head. For a moment, the conqueror of the world turned away in grief. Tears fell down his face. "This was not my wish," he said quietly. "He was once my son-in-law, my friend." Even the gods seemed silent. Caesar had won, but the victory brought no joy, only realization. The Republic was gone. In its place stood a new kind of power, one that lived not in law or senate, but in the will of a single man. He ordered Pompey's body to be given an honorable burial. The man he had defeated, he now honored as a Roman hero. "For in defeating Pompey," Caesar told his men, "I have slain the last defender of the old world." And thus the war that had begun in ambition ended in sorrow. The river of history had turned red, and no man, not even Caesar, could wash it clean. The world remembers victories and crowns, but seldom the cost of them. The price of power is written not in gold, but in the hearts it breaks. Caesar would go on to rule Rome as its first true dictator. Yet within a few years, his own blood would stain the Senate floor, struck down by those who feared the very power he had created. As for Pompey, his name would fade into legend, a symbol of the old republic, proud but doomed. In the end, both men achieved immortality, not through peace but through the tragedy of their rivalry. The war between Caesar and Pompey had ended. Pompey was gone. The Senate lay in ruins, and Rome, once the proud guardian of liberty, had become a silent witness to change. But for Julius Caesar, triumph was not an ending. It was only the beginning of a new, uncertain era. The shadow of power now stretched over him, darker than any battlefield cloud. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he expected rest. Instead, he found a kingdom divided by its own quarrels. The boy king Ptolemy III ruled beside his older sister Cleopatra, but rivalry and ambition had torn the royal house apart. The Nile shimmered with beauty, but beneath its calm flowed deep currents of betrayal. Caesar entered the palace of the Ptolemies, walls lined with gold, floors of marble, air thick with perfume and whispers. The courtiers bowed, yet their eyes measured him with calculation. They saw in him both a savior and a threat. He had come to demand order and to honor Pompey's memory. But Egypt had other plans. One night, as the torches flickered low, a rug was carried into Caesar's chamber. When it was unrolled, out stepped Cleopatra, veiled in silk, her eyes alight with intelligence and courage. "I come not as a queen," she said, "but as a friend of Rome." Her words were measured, her tone calm, but her gaze was a spark that could light empires. Caesar, ever drawn to brilliance and boldness, listened with fascination. Cleopatra spoke of her vision, a unified Egypt, strong and wise, not ruled by fear. She sought Caesar's support against her brother's court, which had turned against her. Caesar saw in her not just beauty, but ambition, an ambition that mirrored his own. "Two rulers," he said softly, "born in different worlds, yet bound by the same fate, to build what others would destroy." From that moment, their alliance began, political at first, but destined to become legendary. Soon, the palace erupted in chaos. Ptolemy's advisors saw Caesar as a foreign conqueror and Cleopatra as a traitor. Riots filled the streets. Flames danced across the harbor. Caesar's small Roman force was trapped in the palace, surrounded by the Egyptian army. Supplies dwindled, and morale began to crack. Yet Caesar, as always, turned crisis into opportunity. He fortified the palace, defended the docks, and sent messengers to summon reinforcements from Asia Minor. In the heat of the struggle, he worked side by side with Cleopatra, both strategists and dreamers. She spoke of the ancient kings of Egypt, who ruled not with fear, but with divine grace. Caesar spoke of Rome's greatness, born from discipline and destiny. Together, they seemed unstoppable. When Caesar's reinforcements finally arrived, the tides turned. The Egyptian army fell into confusion. Ptolemy fled to the Nile and perished in its waters. Cleopatra was restored as Queen of Egypt, and the city celebrated with music and light. Caesar had once more turned disaster into glory. For months, Caesar remained in Alexandria. The city fascinated him, the libraries, the scholars, the temples rising beside the river. But more than anything, he was drawn to Cleopatra. She was unlike any ruler he had met, educated, eloquent, and unafraid to speak her mind. They would sail together upon the Nile, surrounded by priests, musicians, and servants bearing torches. The river glowed with golden light, and the people whispered that the goddess Isis herself had taken mortal form. In time, Cleopatra gave birth to a child, Caesarion, the little Caesar. The union of Rome and Egypt had given birth to a symbol, part myth, part hope. To Cleopatra, the child was a future king. To Caesar, he was a reminder of legacy, and of the world that still awaited him beyond the sea. News of Caesar's victory in Egypt reached Rome before he did. Some hailed him as a hero, others feared him as a tyrant. When he finally returned, he entered the city in triumph, chariots rolling, banners waving, trumpets sounding. The people cheered, but in the Senate whispers grew louder. Was he a savior or a threat to liberty itself? The senators remembered how Pompey had fallen. They saw in Caesar the same ambition, the same hunger for power. Yet they also saw something more dangerous, the love of the people. Caesar gave generous feasts, canceled debts, and passed reforms to aid the poor. He rebuilt temples, repaired roads, and expanded citizenship. His name became a symbol of strength. But as his statue rose beside that of the old gods, the idea of the Republic began to fade. During one public festival, a supporter placed a golden wreath upon Caesar's head. The crowd gasped. For a moment, silence hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Caesar removed the crown and smiled. "The people of Rome," he said, "have no need for kings." The crowd cheered wildly, yet some senators saw it differently. To them, the gesture was not humility, but testing. Would Rome accept a crown one day, if offered more cleverly? Behind marble pillars and shaded courtyards, men began to whisper. The name Brutus was spoken again and again, a man noble, loyal, and torn between friendship and duty. The Republic, though broken, still had defenders. And in their hearts, fear began to grow. At night, Caesar would often stand upon his balcony, gazing at the stars above the Tiber. He had won every war, crossed every sea, and bent history to his will. Yet peace eluded him. He thought of Pompey, once his ally, then his rival. He thought of Cleopatra, waiting in Egypt with their child. He thought of Rome, restless and proud. "Perhaps," he murmured to himself, "the gods envy those who rise too high." In the streets below, his soldiers kept watch, torches flickering like restless spirits. The city slept uneasily, dreaming of crowns, daggers, and destiny. Power, Caesar learned, is a flame, brilliant and warm, but merciless to those who hold it too long. He had sought to save Rome, yet he now stood apart from it, half ruler, half legend. His reforms brought peace, but his presence brought unease. The Republic that had once raised heroes now feared them. And so, in the quiet halls of the Senate, where marble echoed like whispers of ghosts, a plan began to form. A plan that would change the world once again. Rome had never seen such splendor. After years of chaos, Julius Caesar restored order, rebuilt temples, and filled the city with games, parades, and laughter. The markets flourished, the streets glowed with new marble, and the people hailed him as the bringer of peace. In every corner of the empire, from Gaul to Egypt, his name carried power. Merchants spoke of his laws with respect. Soldiers toasted his victories with pride. Artists carved his face in stone. Poets sang of his destiny. Yet beneath the music of praise, an uneasy silence grew. Some whispered that the Republic was dying, that liberty itself was vanishing beneath the shadow of one man as greatness. The Senate, once Rome's proudest institution, now lived in two worlds, one that feared Caesar and one that adored him. Many senators owed him their positions, their wealth, their safety. They bowed deeply, smiled widely, and whispered flattery as he passed. But others, men of old blood and older pride, looked upon him with quiet dread. They remembered the Republic, when no man stood above the law. They saw Caesar crowned with honors, seated upon a golden chair, his image stamped upon coins. They asked each other, was this still Rome, or the beginning of a monarchy? Among them was Marcus Junius Brutus, a man known for his virtue, intelligence, and calm spirit. He was respected by all, even by Caesar himself, who once called him "my son." Brutus admired Caesar, yet his heart belonged to the Republic. To him, freedom was Rome's greatest treasure, and it was slipping away. As winter passed into spring, the city prepared for the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month. It was a day for ceremonies and public speeches. Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, had grown anxious. For several nights she dreamed of omens, statues weeping, eagles falling from the sky, rivers running red beneath the moon. "My husband," she pleaded, "do not go to the Senate tomorrow. The signs are against you." Caesar smiled gently and took her hand. "My dear Calpurnia," he said, "cowards die many times before their deaths. The brave taste death but once." He believed in destiny. To him, every triumph and every sorrow had been written by the gods long before his birth. In dark corners of the city, away from the music and torches, a group of senators gathered in secret. They spoke in hushed tones, words heavy with guilt, yet driven by duty. Cassius, the restless soldier, spoke first. "If Caesar takes the crown, we are no longer citizens but subjects." Brutus lowered his gaze. "He has not taken it," he said. Cassius replied, "Not yet." They agreed to act before it was too late. Their goal, they told themselves, was not revenge, but restoration. To save the Republic, even if it meant striking down its greatest leader. The plan was simple. They would confront Caesar in the Senate, where weapons were forbidden and trust still lingered. Each man left that meeting with a heavy heart, knowing that history would remember them forever, though not always kindly. Morning came, golden and cool. Caesar dressed in his white robe, a wreath upon his head, ready to attend the Senate meeting at the theater of Pompey, a place built by the very man he had once defeated. As he prepared to leave, a messenger brought him a scroll, a list of names, a warning. But the crowd outside was large, and Caesar, in his confidence, placed the note aside, unread. At the steps of the theater, a seer called out to him, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar laughed lightly. "The Ides have come," he said. "Yes," the seer replied, "but not yet gone." Inside, senators rose to greet him. Their faces were calm, their words polite. No hint of what was to come. They surrounded him with flattery, asking questions about new laws and honors. Then, as if guided by invisible hands, the circle grew tighter. What followed was not a battle, nor a scene of rage, but a moment of destiny fulfilled. Caesar, realizing too late the meaning of the whispers, looked around the room not with anger, but with disbelief. His eyes met those of Brutus. The man he had trusted most now stood among his accusers, his hand trembling, his face pale as marble. In that instant, all ambition, all triumph, all pride fell away. Caesar's voice, filled with sorrow rather than fury, spoke softly, "Et tu, brute?" And in those words lay the end of an age. The senators stepped back. The deed was done. The room was silent but for the echoes of history itself. News spread through Rome like wildfire. Crowds gathered, shouting in grief and confusion. Some wept openly, throwing flowers upon the streets. Others cheered, calling the act the rebirth of freedom. But soon the cheers faded. The people had loved Caesar too deeply. They began to ask, "What is liberty without peace?" At Caesar's funeral, the crowd's sorrow turned to fury. Mark Antony, his loyal friend and general, raised his voice to the heavens. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. When the poor cried, Caesar wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. The people could no longer contain their grief. The city burned with emotion. The dream of the conspirators to restore the Republic was already lost. Brutus fled from the city in silence. He had acted for Rome, but Rome no longer understood him. The Senate dissolved into chaos. Factions formed, and civil war returned once more. From the ashes rose Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and Mark Antony, his most trusted ally. Together they vowed to avenge him. The Republic, already wounded beyond repair, would never recover. The age of emperors had begun. Years later, poets and philosophers would debate the meaning of Caesar's fall. Was he a hero or a tyrant? A liberator or a destroyer? Perhaps he was all of these things. Perhaps greatness itself carries both light and shadow. As time passed, his name became a title. Caesar, meaning ruler, emperor, lord of all. The republic he left behind faded into memory, but his legacy endured for centuries. In the end, Julius Caesar became what he had always desired, immortal, not through crowns or armies, but through the eternal story of his life. The Senate that once ruled the ancient world now stood divided and silent. The marble floors of Rome still echoed with the footsteps of men who had believed they could control destiny. But destiny, as it often does, had chosen its own path. Julius Caesar was gone, yet his shadow lingered in every corner of the city. His statues still stood tall in the forums. His reforms continued to shape daily life, and his name, once a symbol of rebellion, became the symbol of power itself. The conspirators who had raised their hands against him found no glory in their act. Instead of freedom, they had unleashed fear. Instead of restoring the Republic, they had opened the door to something far greater and far more lasting. In the quiet that followed Caesar's death, two men emerged from the storm. Mark Antony, his loyal general, and Octavian, his young adopted heir. Antony was strong, passionate, and fiery, the soldier who had fought beside Caesar through every campaign. Octavian, though young, was thoughtful, cautious, and remarkably wise for his years. He carried Caesar's name, and with it the burden of legacy. At first, the two stood united in grief, promising to honor the fallen leader. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a political alliance to bring peace to Rome. But peace built upon power is fragile, and soon ambition began to stir once more. Antony took command in the east and formed an alliance with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt and mother of Caesar's child. Octavian remained in Rome, gaining the loyalty of the Senate and the people. Two heirs of Caesar now stood upon the stage of history, not as allies, but as rivals. The world once more held its breath as East and West prepared for war. In the glittering waters near Actium, fleets gathered, the final battle for control of Rome. Antony fought with courage, Cleopatra by his side. But Octavian's strategy proved sharper, his patience deeper. When the winds turned against Antony's ships, Cleopatra's fleet withdrew, and chaos spread across the sea. Antony's forces crumbled, and his fate was sealed. He and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, rather than surrender, they chose to end their story together, their love and loyalty immortalized in tragedy. Octavian returned to Rome victorious. He was young, calm, and unchallenged, the master of a world that once tore itself apart. In the years that followed, Octavian reshaped the government, not by destroying the Republic, but by transforming it. He kept the Senate, the laws, and the titles, but beneath it all, true power rested with him alone. In time, he took a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one, and thus the Roman Empire was born. The people rejoiced, the wars were over, the streets safe again, the treasury full. Temples rose, poets sang, and Rome entered its golden age, an age of peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Yet even as Augustus ruled wisely, he never forgot the man who had made it all possible. In the marble halls of his palace hung the bust of Julius Caesar, the man who had dreamed beyond the limits of his time. Julius Caesar had once sought to save the Republic, yet his actions had ended it. He had sought to unite Rome, yet his ambition had divided it, and yet through those contradictions a new world had been born. His name became eternal. Every emperor who followed carried the title Caesar, from Augustus to Nero, from Constantine to rulers centuries beyond Rome's fall. Even in distant lands and later languages his name lived on. Kaiser in Germany, Tsar in Russia, echoes of a man who once stood alone against history. The Republic perished, but the idea of Rome, its discipline, its law, its architecture, its dream of civilization, endured for more than 1,000 years. History remembers Julius Caesar not only for what he conquered, but for what he revealed, that power is never merely a sword, but a mirror of the soul that holds it. He showed that ambition can build nations or destroy them, depending on the heart that guides it. He showed that even the greatest leader cannot escape the choices of his own creation. And he showed that ideals, freedom, unity, order, must be balanced, or they will turn upon each other as Rome once did. Centuries have passed since Caesar's time, yet the story of Rome still speaks to us. Its ruins still stand beneath the Italian sun, silent, majestic, eternal. Tourists walk where senators once debated, where Caesar once dreamed, where empires once rose and fell. In the hush of the Forum, among the broken columns and forgotten stones, one can almost hear the faint echo of his words. I came, I saw, I conquered. But perhaps his greatest conquest was not of nations or armies, it was of time itself. For while kingdoms fall and empires fade, the name of Caesar endures, a symbol of vision, courage, and the unending human desire to shape destiny. When Rome turned against itself, it was not only a war of men, but a war of ideas. Freedom against order, ambition against loyalty, destiny against restraint. And from that struggle, the world inherited its greatest lesson, that every age must choose its own balance between liberty and power, between what is right and what is possible. In the end, Julius Caesar's life remains both a warning and an inspiration. A man who dreamed beyond the limits of his time, who built an empire from the ashes of a republic, and whose story reminds us that even the mightiest fall, but their legacy can light the way for generations to come.